Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to make sure until I got the signal that we're on live. Should anyone be sick at home and wants to watch it from there. This morning, Pastor Kevin and I are talking about Nicaea because it's one of the significant events of this month. What are some other things that we think of this week, this month? Who, for example, won the Kentucky Derby just recently? Anybody watch that? The horse was Sovereign. Did you have any money on that horse? No. Who won the Cubs game and the Brewers game yesterday? Down. Well, and 3 home runs in the 4th inning by the Cubs, so that was celebratory for them. And for us today, we're celebrating the fact that 1700 years ago this month, on May 20th specifically, the council met in Nicaea. And that's a fascinating story. So we're going to bring it up to date today with some historical background, talk a little about the fact that May 20th is the date when it began. It ran a couple months, and there was some fisticuffs that took place in between as people got angry with one another and tried to settle it their way, but out of it came the Nicene Creed. I have an interesting memory of that. Some years ago, my wife and I went to Istanbul, and we went to the Church of Hagia Reina, Holy Peace, and it was a magnificent old building, which is now a museum, and there was a man standing in front of what is now a stage, and I made some comments about that this was the place where the Nicene Creed was first spoken, and he said, "You mean that thing we recite in the Anglican Church in England on Sunday mornings?" And I said, "The very thing." And so that is what it is we're going to explore today. What we can remember of the setting is done for us mostly by artists and architects. That's the Palace of Constantine in Nicaea. And while none of it exists, and it's only a guess from some of the foundation work as to what it might have looked like, that's one of the guesses. Looks fairly impressive, does it not? And this is what we're going to discuss in our time together today and also not next week, but the week following. We're going to look at what was the world of 325, the world in which the Nicene Creed had to be written. And then we're going to look, so I'll look at that with you, and then Pastor Kevin will look at what happened when the bishops started coming. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about the actual debates, what took place in those debates, and how the creed resulted from that, and what resulted from it for today. So Nicaea in 2025, what's the implication of it for today? So we are a Nicene church because we confess the Nicene Creed. But there are churches which do not, for a variety of reasons. They can be churches which just say creeds aren't important or creeds are wrong. And so we'll get into that as we bring it up to date. Let me just see if I got the right slides. So I like this picture of Constantine. There are a lot of statues of Constantine the Great, Constantine I, which exist for us today. He has a big nose on that one, and I rather like it because this was fashioned in Constantine's own lifetime. So he saw it, and he could have said, "That's not me," but it remained, and there are likenesses like that which are reproduced in other places. Let's say some things about his life, and then also about the challenges which he faced once he became the emperor, the Augustus. He was born in a place which today would be Serbia, and so In that sense, he was a Roman citizen because that portion of the world was the Roman Empire. His father was Constantius. He was a pagan, as was Constantine as he grew up. He was a general. He was one of 4 tetrarchs. So tetrarch means 4, and there were 4 emperors, as you will, 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars stationed around the known Roman world. They included, if I can remember them all, Maximius, Galerian, Constantius, that's the father of Constantine, and who am I missing? Maybe it'll come to me, but there were 4. And his mother, on the other hand, was an interesting person for us. Many of us know of her, Saint Helena. She was a peasant woman, some say a barmaid. Some suggest she was really never married to Constantine's father. She was a mistress, but she was Christian, as opposed to the father who was pagan. And she imparted her Christian faith to Constantine, who grew up with that. And during the course of her life, she was then sent to Palestine to identify those places where Jesus had lived out important portions of his life. So she went to Bethlehem and established the Church of the Nativity. She went to Jerusalem and established, through her son's Largus, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And so even today we remember that those buildings have roots which go all the way back to the time of Helena. The actual buildings themselves are more from the time of Justinian. And the father died in 306.
306.
And the son was elected the Augustus, which was a rank higher than Caesar. So the 2 top ranks were Augustus and Caesar were the 2 ranks under, and the 4 tetrarchs, 2 of them were Augustus and 2 of them were Caesars. And in 324, he became the sole ruler, having defeated Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge battle just outside of Rome. So that's a kind of a marking point at which he then took over the Roman Empire. In 313, before that already, along with the remaining empire, Licentius, he had proclaimed the Edict of Milan, which was an edict of permission for people to become Christian. So it was not an edict which said Christianity is now the sole religion or the state religion, as some people think of the Roman Empire. It was that it existed, it was allowed to exist along with other religions without being persecuted. Some things were happening in Rome, we'll talk about it in just a moment, and he realized that it was time to move on and to establish a capital in what we know today as Istanbul. He renamed New Rome, later Constantinople, and for 1,000 years it retained that name and that authority until the end of the Byzantine Empire, I mean the Ottoman Empire. In 325 he established the Council of Nicea, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But what were some of the things that were happening to the empire at that time? There was a decline of Roman authority generally taking place, new directions being called for, largely because the barbarians were gathering around the borders of the empire. And the empire was being threatened by barbarian hordes. It's kind of a nasty name for people who came from different ethnic groups.
The languages divided the world, and I'm not talking about now the languages of all the ethnic groups, but basically Latin and Greek, and we'll take a look at that on a map. There was a need for a new monetary system, and Constantine developed that. It's called the solidus. It's a gold coin. I looked on the internet, you can get one today for $5,000 from various coin shops. And the religious challenges which were facing the empire were remarkable, and that's ultimately what brings us to Nicaea. So a couple of maps which back up what we're going to talk about. This map talks about languages. And so you can see some minority languages in what is Normandy in France and in the England, UK, the Celtic language, which some would say has its roots in Galatia, in Turkey. Illyrian, a predecessor of Greek, Thracian, Libyan languages over here, and Coptic in Greek. But the major languages were Latin, the dark red, and Greek, the green. And the center of the world, which we're going to be focusing on, is right here. So this is Nicaea, and right up here is Constantinople. So at Constantinople is the bridge between Europe and Asia. A remarkable kind of a spot where the two continents come together at that very point. What problems would that pose for the Christian community as it grew? The division of languages, speaking through interpreters, subtle differences in languages that can't be expressed easily in one and yet in the other. There was a big problem when it came to the creed itself, as we'll see when we look into the Nicene Creed as it was written in Greek by a Greek-speaking community. This is a wonderful map because it takes us to what was happening in 325 in the known Roman world, including England. So this is where Constantine starts out as a young man in Asia, in Persia actually, way over on the right side. But his father, one of the tetrarchs, is in England, and he is defending England from a Roman standpoint over against all kinds of tribes. There were 25 different kinds of tribes with their own languages and their own ethnic backgrounds, and he was attempting to consolidate that and bring that together under Roman rule. So Constantine the Great, the first, comes to his father Constantius in England, and they work together for a year, and then the father dies. So the father makes Constantine his successor, makes him Augustus, along with the troops who all celebrate that. And from that point on, we don't know a lot about how his mind worked, but somehow he began to think of himself as emperor of all, not just a tetrarch, one of four, as his father was, but the emperor of the world. Challenging him were lots of different kinds of issues. The barbarian hordes, we'll see in just a moment, were beginning to swoop in to the Roman world. And then there were all these different religious groups. Many we've never heard of. Priscillianism, named often after a person. Donatism here in Carthage. What is that? Should be Sabellianism, I believe. Arianism, which is one of the focuses of the creed. Gnosticism, Marcionism, Montanism. I don't even know what that was. Oh, Ebionism. So those were various religious movements which arose in Christianity, and the focus was on who is Jesus. It was a big challenge for new Christians to try to decide, what could this Jesus really be? Is he God? Is he man? How could he be both? Maybe he's just seeming to be like a man. Maybe he's seeming to be like a God. Maybe he's a ghost. And they used all kinds of words that they could contrive to try to make sense out of who could this Jesus possibly be. And that was a division which Constantine couldn't tolerate, because as he began to dream of one empire, it had to be one in politics and one in faith. And that was quite a vision. There is the challenge of the barbarians coming to us from around the known Roman world, which is the dark line, frontiers, and we can see this dividing line between the two, and that's the Greek, the Latin Greek line comes right next to the boot of Italy, the heel of the boot of Italy, and all the way down to Libya. And then you've got the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Vandals and the Burgundians and all these tribes which are realizing that there's civilization here, and what they're living in, by contrast, is pretty, to use their word, barbaric. So it was a threat to the empire, and it was wise, of course, of Maximian to realize that you really needed, for this kind of a chaotic mess which was developing, 4 emperors, and so hence the tetrarchs, and place them in different positions, 2 over here and 2 over here, so that they could rule what he could not just rule out of Rome anymore. Those are just an example of some of there are about 15 different kinds of heretical groups that arose asking questions about who could this Jesus possibly be. So if we look with our glasses today at what consists in the United States with its great variety of sects, that's nothing new, because already in the 1st century there were all these sects. And usually it was an individual who rose up and said, I believe that this is who Jesus was. And then he got some followers, and that part of the cultural community was known by that person's name. We can't spend a lot of time on all of them. Arianism is the one which we'll focus on when it comes to the creed. Arius was from Alexandria. He was, in effect, challenged by Alexander and the bishop. And bishops in those days were largely the head pastors. So the language is kind of slippery as we move into the Middle Ages, when episcopus, which was the word for bishop in the New Testament, the Greek word, and deacon, those were the 2 terms typically employed. Deacons sometimes ordained, sometimes not. Question is to whether there were female deacons or not, which were ordained. That's the debate which the Roman Catholic Church in some of its far-flung circles still has, and there seems to be some good evidence that there were ordained female deacons. But what did that group of Christians think about Jesus was the thing they wrestled with. Arius said, well, Jesus was not God. Jesus was man. And that word we'll explore in our 2nd session when we ask who are Arian groups today, who may think something similar but would never think of identifying with Arius. I had a group on there which I changed, Nestorians, who followed a man by the name of Nestor, who was the Bishop of Constantinople. Only because I had originally put that picture up there. I found that so fascinating that although Nestorius was one who challenged the wording that was being formed in the creed, saying that Jesus, you could talk about different natures, but you couldn't talk about different persons. And so that was in the 4th century, not now in the, well, that is the 4th century, but that was already in the 5th century. That was challenged, and it extended itself all the way through Persia, India, China, and there were hundreds and hundreds of Christian groups which had emerged in that part of the world and are lost to us today. Because Islam came, Buddhism swallowed up a good portion of it, and I love that piece because it's one of the scraps that was found on a wall in a destroyed monastery that shows 3 Nestorian bishops holding palms. So was it a Palm Sunday picture? We don't really know. But it's one of the few examples that's left to us of what Christianity once was when it moved, even in its heretical form, all the way east through China to Japan. Doesn't exist at all today anymore. We'll have occasion to look at some of those other terms, but big question which remains to us, when it came to Constantine and decide, where should we have this meeting that pulls everything together? There were places where churches had come together for geographical reasons to decide issues before. They were typically called synods. And there were some councils, but they were not ecumenical councils, in other words, worldwide. So when the Council of Nicea came together in 325, it was the first time there were so many bishops, head pastors, who had come from all over the known world. Anywhere between 250 and 380, depends on how you count and who actually came. Only 5 from the west, but all the rest were from the east. And Nicaea is a part of what we call today Turkey. It would have been, in looking at that map, what we know as Asia, across the border from the European side. So Constantinople was. And Constantinople was founded by Constantine in the year before Nicaea, before 325. So it didn't really exist as much, but he had started building this church in Constantinople. And you wonder why in that magnificent building that he was building, it was before the famous Hagia Sophia. So there were 3 Hagias. The Hagia Sophia, in Turkish they say Hagia Sophia, and soften the G. This was the Hagia Irene, which means peace, the holy peace. So the holy wisdom, the holy peace, and I forgot the name of the 3rd one, but there were 3 churches which were established. And this great building still stands. Unlike the Hagia Sophia, it's not used for religious purposes anymore. So you probably all know that the Hagia Sophia is now under Muslim control, even though for many years it was sort of a museum, and then before that for 1,000 years it was a Christian church, the largest Christian church in the world. This one is a museum. And it's where that story that I told you about this guy who said, "You mean this is the place where that thing we confess on Sunday mornings started out?" But they did decide to hold it in Constantinople. It was too new and too young as a city. They decided to hold it. They thought about what we know today as Ankara. Ankara is the capital of Turkey. It was a geographical center, it was a religious center of Galatia, in the heart of Anatolia, which is today Turkey. And they decided to hold it here for a number of reasons, which included the fact that it was right on the Black Sea. There were cooling winds that came in the absence of air conditioning for a group of 300 men to be packed together into some kind of an old building. And so it's thought that underneath this building, which is a ruin, under the water, that's why it looks so murky, it was dedicated to Saint Neophytus, so we get the word neophyte from that. There was a Roman basilica. It was a building that was used for judicial proceedings, for law court kinds of things, for markets. And in that large building, the council was held when it was not held in Constantine's palace, the assumption that I showed you earlier, what it might have looked like. So that's what stands today, and you can still see it from the edge of the water of the Black Sea.
Why is it under the water now?
Because of rising lake levels. So the Black Sea has risen and covered it over. And it's been doing that for centuries. But it's interesting that it's clear enough to get a picture like that of the foundation. Any thoughts or questions about this first piece of Nicaea, its history from Constantine on, its geography, its buildings? Come, Pastor Carl.
What happened to Constantine to move him to change the power structure away from Rome? Because Acts of the Apostles, the scripture, all kind of concentrically ends up in Rome. So something happens in Italy that forces Constantine to create this new capital.
Yeah.
What was that conflict?
Well, I think it was several of the things that we've mentioned.
Okay.
So the barbarian invasions and threat.
More
on the
threat in
borders.
Europe and Italy than over in Greece.
Over against the borders of the Roman Empire. They were on the edges of the Roman Empire. And here and there doing potshots into the empire. I think the openness of the Greek world and the possibility of a brand new capital dedicated to his name. I think his vision was rather surprising, that he saw a new world emerging with his name on it and with one religion at the heart of it. The big questions as to how Christian was Constantine really. Some even saying that maybe Eusebius of Nicomedia, for example, became the Archbishop of Constantinople, and he was probably an Arian, and he, it is said, baptized Constantine. So an Arian heretic baptizes the emperor, and the two sons of Constantine, Constans and Constantius, become Arian in faith also. So even though in 325 the creed was established, there was a power in this movement that had come from Alexandria which was overwhelming the empire, and it was only with time that it was expelled by the creed itself, by the recitation of the creed, by the fact that we continue to recite it today and say that that's the basis of our belief. So I just think that he was a remarkable visionary who saw a future in something that had not yet been established and saw declines in the Roman world.
Just a tiny little footnote. It's interesting to me that right here in Wauwatosa, we have Saints Helen and Constantine, Greek Orthodox Church. I
Yeah.
never knew who Saint Helen was.
Yeah, and wouldn't it be nice for us to have a gathering which invites them to come and talk about this together? You know, their roots and our own roots would be interesting. Yes, sir?
Back up a little bit. Which churches, Christian churches, subscribe to the Nicene Creed? Do all of them?
Well, I mean, the Roman Catholic Church, certainly the Orthodox Church, with the exception, I don't want to jump ahead because perhaps
Pastor Kevin's going to talk about the so-called filioque clause in the creed, which came not in Nicaea but subsequently. Then the Anglican Church and the Lutheran Church and the Presbyterian and the Methodist and all mainline churches. I would think that the Pentecostal churches do not recite the creed, even though they don't oppose doctrines in the creed. The Baptist Church does not recite the creeds because they don't want to be creedal. And that's kind of jumping ahead of our story because we'll get into that in detail toward the end. But the mainline churches are creedal churches, and specifically Nicene churches.
So could you tell us what the status of the New Testament is at this time?
And I was coughing at the last part of
I
it.
said, could you tell us what the status of the New Testament is at this time?
Well,
There
I
is-
mean,
it's not yet consolidated yet.
That's a good question because many people have said that the Council of Nicea determined the canon, and that's false. That was really never a part of the discussion at Nicaea. So there were periods in which various portions of the, let's call it the canon, the testaments were accepted by the communities of the church, and that's a whole discussion in itself as to which years different portions were accepted, but Nicaea was not the spot in which it happened, or the time. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Kevin, and he's going to take us into the second part of this discussion.
Yeah, thank you, David, for organizing this 2-week class and inviting me to be a part of it. This has been fun for me because I learned about Nicaea in seminary, but what I learned about with Nicaea was actually pretty different than what David invited me to teach about. So I did some learning, and a lot of the learning I'm sharing are the parts I honestly just thought was the most interesting. So hopefully you find those pieces interesting as well. I wanted to speak to kind of a couple of things. One thing that's interesting about Nicaea, this will come up more in the second class when we get into the theological substance of Nicaea a little bit more. To Don's question about kind of like non-Nicene churches. One of the things that's interesting about Nicaea is we don't there aren't any like explicitly like non-Nicene church per se in existence right now. Kind of they have kind of fizzled out. Whereas like for instance, there's a subsequent council in like Chalcedon in 451, and there are non-Chalcedonian churches. Non-Chalcedonian churches meaning some of the like the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt, for instance, would not subscribe to Chalcedon. There aren't really the people that don't, that I would say that probably the most notable and I think interesting example of a like non-creedal tradition are a part of what is called the Stone Campbell movement, which emerged in the 19th century in the U.S. Have any of you heard like the Disciples of Christ, like the DOC, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, or the Church of Christ, not the UCC, but the Church of Christ? Both came from a belief that creeds ultimately divided the church, and they don't want to have creeds or things that are division, that would yield division. To answer your question about, is there about the state of the New Testament? At this, ultimately the New Testament emerged, at least as I've been taught, that in practice there wasn't, big picture, there wasn't a lot of controversy over ultimately what to put in the New Testament or not. I mean, there was some dispute and kind of and revelation kind of came and went over time, but in practice, the books that made it into the New Testament were the books that were widely used in the early church by the 4th century. So there is no New Testament per se, but in the debates, people would appeal to scripture that was present in what is now the New Testament. Anyways, we're talking about who arrived to Nicaea, where they came from, and the assembling of the bishops. We're now getting into a little bit more into what happened at the council and what is this council. Before I get into this, I'm curious. If I say the Council of Nicea or Nicaea, what comes to mind? What do we already know or recognize about or like have heard perhaps about Nicaea? Just curious, what information are we bringing in? Cool, so I can basically tell you anything and you're gonna buy it. Yes, this is great. Okay, a couple of things I want to share that are fun to start. So Nicaea, you can see sometimes in our slides it's going to be spelled Nicea, sometimes it's Nicaea. So I'm bringing this up just because it's kind of the Latin versus the Greek spelling. So there's different ways of spelling it. There's an Eastern and a Western church, kind of the Latin and the Greek church. Christianity was spreading. This is a great map David lifted up. Particularly want to lift up, we're now talking about, this is kind of where Christianity was at the time, and they were all kind of beginning to converge on Nicaea. But anyways, who was at Nicaea? This is a wonderful icon David grabbed. Who are the people that are at Nicaea, and why were they gathering? So that's kind of what I'm going to really be focusing on today. Who was there? Why were they coming? A couple of topics to discuss. The most famous one is the first one, the nature of who Jesus is. That's why, for instance, if you look at the Nicene Creed, the middle section on Jesus is a lot longer and has a lot more technical terms than about the Holy Spirit and about the first person of the Trinity, God the Father. This is because there was more disagreements there. People were generally on the same page on the first and the third articles of the Trinity. The second one about Jesus, a lot more debate, had a lot more to say. That's why it's longer. Particularly, there was the Arian controversy. Arius was kind of, that's what it's been branded as over time. So that's the part that we're going to talk about next class, because that's probably the most juicy and most talked about. That's when I went to seminary and was learning about this. That's basically all we talked about. They tried to set a date for Easter. They failed, but they tried. And then there was a bunch of canon law, like setting up church law. I picked some of the more interesting and juicy ones. They tried to talk about whether it was okay for clergy to self-castrate. Don't know the story behind why that was a thing. They agreed, no, not a good idea. Don't do that. So that was, can clergy self-castrate? Nicaea said no. Can clergy lend money with interest? Can clergy participate in usury? No. No. This is a key moment. There is a lot to be said about the history of use of money in the church and in the West. A lot of interesting stuff. That got set in motion. I think we could talk about that for a long time. Really interesting, but that's, again, not really the substance of Nicaea. There wasn't a lot of disagreement. Don't lend money with interest. Can clergy marry? What, for instance, the Roman Catholic Church, as we know, doesn't participate in that. For what it's worth, there were married clergy at Nicaea. And so you could tell how they might have come down. They ultimately didn't really come to a decision on that as well. So these are some of the things, just like kind of nitty-gritty church law, some of which being kind of salacious, some of which being honestly just a lot more boring. Setting a date for Easter and fail, and then particularly the nature of the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity as we now know it. Who was at Nicaea? Now this is a really interesting topic, and I think that as we get into it, there is a degree of mythologizing that happened with who was at Nicaea, and there's a lot of murkiness on it. First off, the traditional number was that there were 318 people that were at Nicaea. Maybe, why 318? Maybe that is an oddly specific number that they just happened to keep attendance and keep track of it. Or maybe it's because when Abraham gathered his servants that had been circumcised, in Genesis 14, there were 318 of them. That's kind of the suspicion that often the agreement today is the 318 number is a part of mythologizing rather than actually who was there. But anyways, most scholars say there's between 250 and 300. I don't know exactly why they came to that number. For what it's worth, I went and there's a whole Wikipedia page on the people that signed the Council of Nicea, the Nicene Creed, the Council of Nicea. And they listed 199 people. I looked, there's 12 of them that had Wikipedia pages. So so we're looking at how people are famous from Nicea, not a whole lot. But so there's at least 199 people there. We know that. Who was at Nicea? And I think there's a degree of mythologizing here as well. Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote like kind of the preeminent early church history, also wrote a book called The Life of Constantine. And he talks about in this, there's a single house of prayer as if enlarged by God and then sheltered all these kinds of people that came to Nicaea. Syrians and Cilicians and Phoenicians and Arabs kept on going and going and going and going. All over Thrace and Macedonia and Pamphylia and Phrygia. When I read that this week, I was like, you know what, that sounds a lot like Acts 2. When they all came together in one house, in one place of prayer. There are people, and a lot of the list matches Pontus and in Phrygia and Pamphylia and Cappadocia. The list eerily resembles itself. I couldn't find any scholarship that observed this. I think there's something here, though. So basically, the takeaway is that a lot of the early documentation of what happened at Nicaea was kind of self-mythologizing, rather than like maybe something you'd see like printed in a newspaper today. So we don't know exactly how many people were there, but we know that they were from all over, whether that's to try for rhetorical effect or truly from all over. But who was at Nicaea? Now here's a couple of people that I think are famous that we might want to know about or can find interesting. Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, Athanasius of Alexandria. Have any of you heard of Athanasius? Maybe the Athanasian Creed? He kind of made himself famous coming out of Nicaea. Athanasius, we'll talk about this more next class, feisty dude. He was kind of the mentee and protege of Bishop Alexander of Alexandria. He became the next bishop of Alexandria, and he got exiled 5 times as bishop. So he was feisty, and basically anybody that disagreed with him was an Arian. He used that as a name-calling term. So he kind of formed this idea of Arius as like the arch heretic. There was Arius, Athanasius, his friend. No, they weren't friends. They didn't like each other. Arius was a popular church leader in Alexandria. He was a presbyter. Basically, this issue emerged from Alexander and Arius disagreeing and their followers with that. And that was a significant city in the Roman Empire at the time, and Constantine was basically sick of the bickering happening in northern Egypt. A couple other people. Eusebius of Nicomedia, that's someone that David just mentioned. We'll come back to him. A couple other people come to. Aristoxes I, Stratophilus of Pidiant, Maris of Chalcedon, and Nicholas of Myra. I want to start with Nicholas of Myra. Nicholas of Myra, a.k.a. Nicholas the Wonder Worker, a.k.a. Saint Nicholas. Santa Claus. The Santa Claus tradition comes from Saint Nicholas. According to tradition, there is a wonderful, famous legend of how he resurrected 3 children who had been murdered and pickled by a butcher who was planning to sell them as pork during a famine. He also has a tradition of like giving gifts to orphans and caring for little kids. That is kind of what he's famous for. There is no ancient record of him being at Nicaea, but there is a wonderful story of what he allegedly did at Nicaea. He allegedly smacked Arius and was defrocked for a period of time. Is that actually true? I don't know, but it's fun. St. Nicholas may or may not have been there, may or may not have smacked Arius. Definitely cared for kids. So that's one person that's a little bit more dubious. Again, see, there's a degree of mythologizing happening here. Nicholas of Myra, maybe there, maybe not.
Where's Myra?
Myra, oh my gosh. I should have looked that up beforehand. I was more interested in figuring out,
I wonder if it's Italy, because there's a lot of, I don't know.
I think it's somewhere in like Asia Minor.
Yeah.
In somewhere which is present-day Turkey, is that?
I thought it was Turkey.
Yeah, I think it's somewhere in present-day Turkey, but I don't know exactly where.
And Chalcedon, you mentioned Chalcedon something or another.
Yeah.
Where is Chalcedon? What is that?
That is also in present-day Turkey as well.
Okay.
Chalcedon, it's up, David might know this, it's up kind of also in that kind of proximate to what is present-day Istanbul.
Crazy names.
Yeah, they're kind of fun names. We're gonna, Chalcedon, important like definition of the 2 natures of Christ that comes in 451. That's not what I'm talking about Maris. Maris said something, let's talk about Maris. Let's go jump ahead to him. Actually, before we jump ahead to him, so here's the list, and I think to name that most of the bishops that we had came from the eastern portion of the empire. As you look at these names, Eus, these are Greek names. Like Aristoteles, doesn't that kind of almost sound like a Aristotle or Sophocles? These are all Greek sounding names. There aren't that many Latin names here. So again, to show this image that David showed, kind of a similar map of what David showed, this is the Latin world, and this is the Greek world at the time. So that means like Augustine came from down here. This is Latin at the time. This is like, it's kind of hard to even conceive of it at this time, like that like Turkey as we knew it was Greek territory. Like, I'm gonna probably watch the Warriors game tonight because I'm from the Bay Area. The Warriors, one of the players on the other team the Warriors are playing, the Rockets, is from Turkey. His name's Alperen Sengun. Like, there weren't Alperen Senguns in the 4th century because the Turkic people didn't come from the east until later. This is firmly Greek. Firmly Greek. Even down in Turkey, this is before the Arabization of Egypt. Alexandria is like the epicenter of Greek knowledge, perhaps. This is Greek land. Similarly, Morocco, Latin territory. It's weird to even think about, but like the culture and the language was profoundly different. So like this is like the Greek, where is Greek knowledge happening? Maybe a little bit here. Really here, the significant theologians that emerged in the next 50 years come from this area here. It's like today, it's just like a desert with weird rock formations. At the time, it had brilliant Greek people. It's interesting, it shifted. So, but then you can also note that how far east and up this went. Even this is present day Georgia was Greek. We'll talk about that in just a second. So, who else came? Now I want to talk about some of these fun people that came from the east. Aristoteles the First, I want to name him. His dad is a guy named Gregory the Illuminator. That's a sweet name, isn't that? Gregory the Illuminator. Gregory and Aristoteles are Greek names. Gregory the Illuminator was the founder of the Armenian Orthodox Church. He was the first Catholicos of the Armenian Orthodox Church. Aristoteles was the second. So again, these people are married. You can tell he's having kids and all that. So Armenian and Greek at the same time. So this is a representative from the Armenians came. Stratophilius of Pityant. That's a wild name, isn't that? Pityant is now a present part of, is it Abkhazia, which is that like contested part in western Georgia. Is it a part of Russia or is it a part of Georgia? At the time, that's Greek territory. So you can see these people come from way in the east. But then the guy that was like the MC for the whole event came from somewhere, I should have written his name down, came from Spain. So you can see we have people all the way from Spain to Georgia here. So like when you're saying that this is an ecumenical council, meaning worldwide, this is basically like for a time where there weren't planes, trains, and automobiles, like this is pretty dang worldwide at the point. So people come from all over the place that I think are quite interesting. Just want to look up. I might have even written down that guy's name. Here we go. Oh, the guy, I wrote it down. His name is Hosius of Cordoba. So he's from southern Spain. Hosius of Cordoba. People come from all over for this. I want to talk about this guy from Chalcedon. He's not a defender of what becomes the Chalcedonian definition. He is like Churchill before there was Churchill. This is a great quote from him. How about this? So in 362, this is after Constantine has died, and now the emperor is a guy named Julian the Apostate. As you can imagine, Julian the Apostate wasn't particularly Christian. And so by this time, Marius is blind. And so he confronts Julian the Apostate, and Julian tells him, your Galilean God will not heal your sight. Basically, Jesus being from Galilee. Your Galilean God won't heal your sight. And Marius replies, and I quote, I thank God for depriving me the power of beholding your face. So to give you an idea, it's like, thank God I don't have to see you. That sounds like a very formal way of saying I think you're ugly, right? And so one thing you can just see is these people were willing to bicker too. And what they bickered about, we're going to get into that a little bit more in 2 weeks. But Maris of Chalcedon. So he's from present-day Turkey, and he was feisty. Georgia, Armenia. And this is something that I want to lift up again, what David said about Eusebius of Nicomedia. Nicomedia is also like in basically present-day Istanbul today. He was a very significant theologian in the early church, and he also was a supporter of Arius. He offered a statement of faith at the council that everybody shot down. Not everybody, but was shot down. And then ultimately, in his own words, I agree to the council's findings by hand, I sign it, but not by heart. So he really wasn't on board with what this happened. And nevertheless, he was kind of the guy in Constantine's inner circle. He was the one that baptized Constantine on Constantine's deathbed. A lot of feisty guys. I was looking, I have another guy on the list, I didn't write down. Marcellus of Ancyra, he was another controversial bishop. They all bickered with each other a lot. Another famous one, the guy that wrote this history from this life of Constantine that I talked about earlier, was written by another Eusebius of Caesarea. He also was Arian and supported Arius. So one of the things I bring this up and tell you about this is that while the story that Athanasius goes on to tell is that orthodoxy gets defined and Arius the heretic gets kicked to the curb, it's a little bit murkier than that. That it really takes a while for things to settle. And while the council anathematized Arius, there's still that Arius's theological convictions remain. And actually, here's another fun thing to it. We can get into more next class. Did you know the Nicene Creed wasn't actually written at the Council of Nicea? The Nicene Creed that we recite comes from the Council of Constantinople in 381. Because it took 50 years for them to really figure out what they were, and agree ultimately. So there's a lot. So things don't tie up nicely in a bow, which is all Constantine wanted. He just wanted there to be kind of peace and quiet. He didn't want there to be fighting in Alexandria. He set it in motion. It took 50 years to get there. But we're going to get next class a little bit more into the substance of Alexander and Arius's debate. But I'll give you since we have a couple minutes, I'm going to give you a little bit of a sneak preview. I'm going to go back to what David said earlier, had this list of heresies. This Sabellian heresy is a heresy that Arius accused Bishop Alexander of being. He's saying that by you saying that Jesus is God and of one being with the Father, you're not actually talking about the Trinity. You're just saying that there's actually just one God with different manifestations. And then he goes, go and read like Colossians. Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. He's born in creation. The first, but he's born in creation. And Alexander's like, but Jesus is really God. Read John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so they could both point to the Bible, and they could both, and they ultimately argued about Greek philosophical categories and what ultimately was the better way of conceiving of who Jesus was. They went back and forth about this, and really what I learned about in seminary, for better or for worse, was that argument over those Greek philosophical categories. So if you want to see me nerd out, come back in 2 weeks for that. But that's right now I've kind of gotten to the point where I've kind of set the stage of who was there, what are they talking about, where have they come from, can we self-castrate or not? No. Can we lend money with interest? No. How clear can we actually be about what happened? Sorta, kinda. we have a general idea. There's some degree of self-mythologizing going on. Now that I've kind of shared this, I'm curious, like, any immediate like reactions or questions or like, oh, that was interesting, yeah.
Is there some kind of canonization of the real patriarchs versus the phony ones? Who gets kicked off the island? In other words, when you go into a Greek Orthodox church, you're surrounded by the patriarchs.
Yeah.
And who made the Hall of Fame and who got kicked off the island?
That is a great question. I think what basic isn't kind of like, it's like history is written by the victors. I think that's kind of is, I think that there is a degree of just like, whoever kind of won the argument's got to call themselves the patriarch, and whoever lost didn't make it on the wall. I think is my short answer.
There were 50 Gospels, we got 4 of them, you know?
Yeah, well, the 50 Gospels, like that's a long conversation we can have. I think the short-ish answer is that the 4 Gospels that people most widely use today that are in the canon are the Gospels that like were widely used at the time, that were spread, that people were spreading around and sharing, that people recognized. So there was more there. There was a degree of like there was a degree of a theological yardstick, basically professing Jesus, kind of that like Jesus was was God, but really beyond that it was more just like this is what people were using at the time. Dan, I saw your hand up.
I was going to say it's not until 380 that Christianity becomes the official religion.
Correct.
But this is one of the first times that the government and the church work together.
Absolutely.
The government's telling, is that a good thing or a bad thing for the church long term?
Really relevant today.
That is there is a lot to be said on that topic.
I was curious what you thought.
What do I think? I think the short answer is, I think what emerges at Nicaea comes with a lot of baggage, and I don't want to. I think just saying it was all bad is too strong. But if I had to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, my thumb's pointing more down than up. I'd say that. So I'd say we can. So you want one word answer?
Yeah, maybe.
Not great. That's 2. But
And
yeah.
this puts the focus in our faith on belief,
Yeah, absolutely.
as opposed to any number of other
Absolutely.
things. I mean, the Jewish
Absolutely.
tradition has a tradition on questioning,
Absolutely.
debate, and stuff. Ours becomes belief. What's the significance of that for us? That belief becomes the important thing.
I think that's a great question. I think, and some of the questions you're getting into are you're anticipating what's coming
Okay.
in 2 weeks. So come back for that. I think the short answer I would give to that is that one thing we see is that I think this is the great slide about here's the Latin world, here's the Greek world, and the debate they're having is basically how does Christianity integrate with the Greek philosophy of the day, particularly this like Middle Platonism. This is like the epicenter of Middle Platonism. There's a guy named Philo of Alexandria who's a prominent Jewish philosopher as well, who's deeply influential in the first few centuries of Christianity. And so a lot of these questions about belief are arguments around Greek philosophical categories. And I think one of the things that by you saying, oh, should we be focusing on belief or on practice, that contemporary, over the last 1,500 years old, particularly over the last couple hundred, the Western philosophical tradition has moved much more towards interest in practice than in terms of belief. And so if talking about Jesus and who Jesus was, in 330 or 325 required us to talk about belief, today it requires us to talk about practice, I think, as a part of us integrating with the ways of thinking of the world of the day. But in short, is it good that we focused all on belief? I think that by focusing so much on belief, other pieces can potentially get chopped off, and it shouldn't just be about belief. There's also a kind of a lived and embodied part of that for sure. Yes, Paul?
How would you become a bishop at this time?
It's a good question. It seems like Athanasius did a lot of brown nosing. So he just like followed in Alexander's footsteps, and Alexander just was like, I like this Athanasius guy. Augustine becomes a bishop against his own will. He literally gets like forced into ministry because he was just considered such a he was so respected and so erudite. He was like one of the leading scholars of his day in rhetoric, which was a deeply important field. So I guess this is a degree of speculation, but it seems a lot like often the church leaders were like, I like this guy, I'm going to pick him. So it didn't seem particularly democratic. Like Ambrose of Milan was like, I want this guy for Augustine. Yeah, Don?
In those days, it was called hegemony. There were no, in other words, like the Pope, there were no College of Cardinals. They didn't elect them. The rich families fought to see whose son would be the Pope. And the same thing for bishops and other officials. It was the rich families that put their people in these positions. And you mentioned Abkhazia. I had to smile because there are two other regions, Transnistria and South Ossetia. These people in these regions today consider themselves independent. They even print their own postage stamps.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Thank
And
you.
I got some.
Yeah. Hi, Connor.
So what's happening at this time with the traditional Greek and Roman gods and their constituencies, and also what's happening between the Jewish faith and this newly emerging consensus or unity around the Christian faith?
Those are big,
Yeah.
big questions. Man, I would need to do a little bit more like learning to give you a really confident answer, particularly to like some of the, how popular, like at this point, how much were like the Greco-Roman pantheon of gods around? I'm not sure. Most of the early church were in conversation with, particularly with more like philosophers. So I would say that, which leads me to think that the pantheon of gods, while they were there, wasn't a place of particular concern. They were more concerned when Origen was writing, about 75 years before this, he was more concerned about what a guy named Celsus was saying, how Christianity isn't intellectually coherent, rather than saying that Christianity somehow was like a bad alternative to Zeus. So that's kind of my short answer. David, did you have your hand up to add to that?
Well, excuse me. We have a big painting in our wall of a curanda in Mexico, and there's this boy standing in front of her who is, you can tell by his big eyes that he's sick with something, and she's trying to cover all the bases. So she's got an eggshell cracked in one hand where she's letting the yolk fall out, and she's got a rosary in the other hand, and she's doing it all at once to try to cure this boy. And I think that's true in Mexico and in many Central American countries, South American countries today. You've got a lot of people who practice both ends of the candle because they aren't quite sure which one the healing is going to come from. That surely was also true in the pagan world.
John Chrysostom gives a talk in which he criticizes his congregation because they were having a particularly bad year with their crops, and they were going to synagogue on Saturday and church on Sunday and hoping that one of them solved their problem.
Yeah.
So it's called parting of the ways, the separation between the two, but it's hard to see where exactly the separation between Judaism and Christianity.
And it took centuries.
And that, and also with the kind of that, with Christianity becoming like kind of the state church and kind of Christianity persecuting Judaism, that was a kind of a later thing. These are both, because Judaism by this point, the temple had fallen, had been destroyed, and so for Judaism, was figuring out what does it mean to be Jewish without a temple. And Christianity was, in many ways, like another account of how to be Jewish without a temple. So these are in many ways sister religions that admittedly bickered a lot. Again, these guys like to bicker, but also there was setting the framework for anti-Semitism about Jews killed Jesus, et cetera, as well with that. So it's a great question. I would be lying if I could speak with a high degree of confidence about exactly what was emerging at that point. That just wasn't an area of primary concern. Yeah.
Some of those heresies here listed sound
Yeah.
rather attractive to me, or like, yeah, it might make some sense. How important is it that on a personal level, we buy into everything in the Nicene Creed?
Well, those are two different things. And I would agree that the heresies, I think there's a degree of mythologizing with the name calling of the heretics later. I think that you're onto something there. How much do we need to buy into every word of the Nicene Creed? I think that's a great conversation for us to have next class when we get into some of the substance of the Nicene Creed. I think it's a very interesting conversation. And maybe I'll get to you in just a second, Andy, tying together one thing that's interesting about the Nicene Creed over against the Apostles' Creed, which is emerging around a similar time. The Apostles' Creed is people say, I believe, because that is the creed that one confesses leading up to baptism. It's like basically, you need to say this to get baptized. The Nicene Creed is we believe, this is the church's official statement. So one's kind of a bottom-up, one's kind of a top-down creed. They fill very different functions originally in church. And so I would say that the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, I might give you a little bit of a different answer on that.
So the book of Luke was written for a Greek audience, right?
Correct.
And was this primarily lifted up as the primary New Testament, gospel throughout that whole Greco region at this time, or is it hard to make that?
Oh man, that is a great question, and I would say, depends on who you're asking. I would say that that down in Alexandria, they really were sympathetic, to John with some of that John 1. But I would say that Luke was certainly well used. But is it all about Luke? I think I don't know. I think that since I don't know, would lead me to think that the answer is probably not. But because it had been a couple 100 years, and all the books had kind of spread around by that point. Yeah.
There are no teachings of Jesus in any of the creeds. It's all about who is God.
Well, it's because of the things that people disagreed about.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Later on, what's going on now with bishops around the world
Yeah.
is more what do we believe when
Yeah.
we pick somebody.
Exactly.
Conservative, liberal, all that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, the stuff that was in it is the stuff that people argued about. Because like that.
Follow the canon, right? People don't realize, but Pope Francis is Italian. He was an Italian immigrant. But everybody says, no, he's from South America.
Yeah, Argentina.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mom and Dad were Italian.
Yeah. Well, I need to wrap because I need to get into the next service, but I'd love to continue this conversation. I'm really glad that a lot of the questions you're asking about the substance of what they argued about is honestly the stuff I find most interesting about that, and that's what we're talking about in 2 weeks. So come back with your questions and be ready to wrestle with what were they talking about with like Arius and Alexander and Athanasius. What is this creed's theology? Do we need to buy into it? Should we?
Hey, brother,
were they right?
You gotta go preach.
Thank you all. See you in 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
I have the answer to your question. You do. There you go.